Go ahead and open Comp 3, Squash and Stretch. If you've ever seen a Saturday morning cartoon, you're probably already familiar with the animation principle of squash and stretch. Squash and stretch has a huge amount of potential to really inject a lot of fun and playfulness into your animation. We can use squash and stretch in a strictly literal sense, to communicate something about the material properties of this object. If it has a lot of squash and stretch, then that implies it's very elastic and flexible. Perhaps it's made of rubber. If it has very little squash and stretch, then it's probably made of sterner stuff, steel or a bowling ball or wood. So it can communicate to your audience on that level. But on another level, it can also communicate a lot about the mood and attitude that you're trying to project. Your animation may consist entirely of just graphics and text. The point may not be to communicate some literal information about the material properties of an object. You may be using squash and stretch just to kind of inject a lot of fun and playfulness into your animation. If you're creating something that's humorous or has a lot of whimsy, that might be appropriate. If you're animating something for children, a lot of squash and stretch would certainly be appropriate. So keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and put this idea squash and stretch into practice. And the big thing that you should remember about squash and stretch is that the object should always appear to maintain its volume. So what that means, imagine you're holding a balloon between your hands, and you press your hands together, squeezing the balloon between your hands. It's going to compress in that direction, but the air inside that balloon has to be displaced to somewhere. So you're going to squash the balloon one direction, but that balloon is going to expand in the other direction, always maintaining its volume. So that's the important thing to remember. So for example, this ball that we're getting ready to animate, when it falls into frame and hits the ground, it's going to squash down towards the ground. That means we need to actually scale it up in the other dimension. It's going to expand horizontally if it compresses vertically. So let's go ahead and set our position keyframes first, and then we'll do some squash and stretch by animating the scale parameter. So I'm going to select my shape layer here. That's this shape layer with a red gradient in it that looks like a ball. And I'll hit P to pull up position. Click your stopwatch to set the first keyframe. And this is actually where I want the ball to impact the ground. I'll just jump forward 10 frames. And I'll just slide that keyframe over to there because that's where I want it to hit the ground. So now we'll back up to the beginning of the comp, and I'll move the ball off the top of the screen. So now it's going to animate in and hit the ground. So if this ball's made of rubber, it's going to bounce, right? So when it hits the ground, it's going to bounce back up. So from our second keyframe, let's advance another 10 frames. So I'll hit Shift Page Down, and we'll move our ball up, maybe something like that. Shift Page Down again, and our ball is going to fall back to the ground. So I'll just copy and paste that second keyframe, which is this position, and then go forward 10 more frames, and we'll move the ball up again. Go forward another 10 frames, paste our keyframe on the ground again, and I think I'll do one more little bounce. So let's go forward 10 more frames, move the ball up, forward 10 more frames, and paste. So ball falls and bounces a few times. Now we're also getting a little bit of that weirdness where After Effects is trying to do a continuous Bezier keyframe but all our keyframes are in a straight line, so it can cause a little loop that makes our layer actually overshoot our keyframes. So just to prevent that, since our ball's falling and bouncing in a straight line, it'll help us if we convert all these keyframes, right click on them, go to keyframe interpolation, and let's convert their spatial interpolation to linear. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is when our ball bounces back up, it's going to slow. As it's bouncing up, gravity is going to be pulling it back in the opposite direction, right? So it's gradually going to slow to a stop before gravity takes over and drags it back down towards the ground. So all of our keyframes that are at the peak of the bounce, we need to select just those keyframes and easy ease them. So I'll select those keyframes, right click on them, go to keyframe assistant, easy ease, and I'm gonna go down to about 3 seconds, hit the letter N to trim our work area, and let's render a RAM preview to see what that looks like so far. Okay, so I think our last couple of bounces are too slow. So I'm just going to slide these keyframes to the left to speed the motion up. Yeah, that feels better. Okay, now let's add our squash and stretch. So I'm going to hit Shift S to pull up our scale parameter. Let's go ahead and set a keyframe. Click our stopwatch to set our first keyframe at 100%. And then we'll go to our first impact keyframe. And that's where we want it to squash. So we've got to turn off our little link here for scale so that we can scale the horizontal and the vertical scales independently. So we want to scale it down maybe to 80, which means we need to scale it up by about 120 in the vertical dimension, or I'm sorry, in the horizontal dimension. Then at the peak of the next bounce, it's going to return to 100%. And then the next bounce, it'll squash a little bit less. So let's try 85 by 115. And it's going to return to 100 again. And I'm going to copy that keyframe so that I can just paste it and I won't have to type 100 every time I want that keyframe. This time let's only scale it down 90 because each bounce gets less, so it's probably going to squash a little less each time. Go to our next position keyframe and then paste our scale value of 100%. It's going to hit the ground again. We'll have it squash a little bit, 95 by 105. And then I'll go forward a few frames and then paste our 100% scale keyframe so it returns to 100%. We'll render RAM preview, and our problem is it's squashing before it actually hits the ground, because After Effects is interpolating between these scale keyframes, but it's not actually going to squash until it strikes the ground, right? So let's select the first keyframe and then every other keyframe, and we're going to make those hold keyframes. So right click and go to toggle hold keyframe. And you guys remember what a hold keyframe does. It tells the layer to hold that property value until it reaches the next keyframe. So in other words, there is no interpolation between those keyframes. So it's not going to squash until it hits that keyframe. So let's see what that looks like. So that looks more natural. We probably actually need one more little bounce, a couple more position keyframes, but you get the idea. Okay, so now your job is to take layer 2, which is the word squash, and do the exact same thing. Make that text fall into screen and squash and stretch so it looks like it's made of rubber.